cathedral was silent. 600 guests, white roses, crystal chandeliers. Everything was perfect. The vows were spoken. The priest smiled and said, "You may now kiss the bride." She leaned in. She tilted her chin. She closed her eyes. But he stepped back, in front of everyone. Then he leaned close to her ear and whispered, "My heart belongs to someone else." The first 3 rows heard it. A gasp rippled through the church. The bride stood frozen, lips still parted, bouquet trembling in her hands. He turned and walked away from the altar, but here's the thing. No one in that room knew the real reason behind those words, not even her. The cathedral was silent, the way only sacred places can be, heavy with breath and expectation, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. 600 guests filled the pews of St. Bartholomew's in Midtown Manhattan, draped in designer gowns and Italian wool, their faces arranged in careful expressions of admiration. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across marble floors. White roses climbed the altar in cascading arrangements that had taken 3 florists an entire week to complete. Amy Reed stood at the end of the aisle in a gown that cost more than her mother's house, her fingers trembling around a bouquet of peonies. She was 24 years old. She was about to marry a man she had met exactly 3 times. Max Green waited at the altar. He stood the way he always stood, perfectly still, shoulders squared, a jaw set like it had been carved from something harder than bone. He was 34, tall, dark-haired, with the kind of face that women noticed and men instinctively feared. His eyes were the gray of winter storms, and they held the same warmth. The organs swelled. Amy walked. Her father's arm was rigid beneath her hand, his grip too tight, and she could feel the faint tremor in his wrist. He was afraid. Everyone in this cathedral was afraid of the man waiting at the end of this aisle, including the priest. The vows were spoken. Max's voice was low and steady, mechanical, as though he were reading terms of a contract. Amy's voice shook, but she made it through. She told herself this was enough. She told herself she could learn to live beside this man, in his world, behind his walls. And then the priest said, "Han, you may now kiss the bride." Amy turned to face him. She looked up into those storm-gray eyes and saw nothing. No warmth, no anticipation, no recognition that this moment was supposed to mean something. But she leaned in anyway. She rose slightly on her toes, tilted her chin, and moved toward his lips. Max pulled away, not subtly, not with a polite turn of the cheek. He stepped back, a full, deliberate step, and the space between them became a canyon. 600 people watched it happen. 600 pairs of eyes widened in unison. Then he leaned close to her ear, so close she could smell the cedar and smoke on his skin, and he whispered, "My heart belongs to someone else." His voice was barely audible, but in the acoustics of that cathedral, the words carried. The first 3 rows heard it clearly. What a gasp rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. Amy didn't move. She stood there with her lips slightly parted, her bouquet clutched against her chest, and she felt something inside her crack, not break, not shatter, but crack, the way a foundation cracks before a building knows it's in trouble. Max turned from the altar and walked down the aisle. His men fell into step behind him like shadows. The reception would proceed. The marriage was legally binding, but everyone in that cathedral understood the same truth. This was an arrangement. Nothing more. The Green estate sat on 12 acres in the hills above the Hudson, a fortress of stone and iron disguised as a mansion. Amy arrived in the back of a black SUV, still in her wedding dress, and still wearing the diamond earrings Max's people had delivered to her hotel room that morning. A gift with no card. A housekeeper named Dolores met her at the door. She was a stout woman in her 60s with kind eyes and careful hands, and she led Amy through hallways that smelled of wood polish and old money. "Your room is this way, Mrs. Green." "My room," Amy repeated. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Green's quarters are in the east wing." Separate wings. Amy almost laughed. She had expected distance, but this was architectural. The room was beautiful. Cream walls, a canopy bed, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, Her suitcases had already been placed near the closet. Someone had put fresh flowers on the nightstand. It was a lovely cage. She sat on the edge of the bed, still in her gown, and stared at her reflection in the window. The girl staring back looked like a stranger, someone wearing a costume, playing a role she hadn't rehearsed. There was a knock on the door. She expected Dolores, but when she opened it, Max stood there. He had changed into a dark shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and for the first time she noticed the tattoo that climbed from his wrist and disappeared beneath the fabric. "I want to be clear about something," he said. No greeting, no apology. Just directness, like a blade. "You were clear enough at the altar," Amy said. She was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise maybe, or something close to respect. "This marriage protects your family. Your father's debts are erased. Your brother stays out of prison. In return, you live here. You attend events with me when required. And you don't ask questions about my business. And what do you get?" "An image," he said flatly. "Stability. The appearance of a life that certain associates expect me to have." Amy studied him. Behind the coldness, behind the control, she thought she saw something else, a tiredness so deep it had settled into his bones. "You could have just told me this before the wedding," she said. "Before I stood in front of 600 people and was humiliated." "You're right," he said. Then he turned and walked away. No apology, no explanation, just the sound of his footsteps retreating down the hallway, steady and unhurried, the way a man walks when he has already decided he owes the world nothing. Amy closed the door and pressed her back against it. She breathed, in, out, in, out. She told herself she would not cry. She told herself that she'd survived worse. Her mother's death, her father's gambling, her brother's arrest. She had survived all of it with her spine straight and her heart intact. She would survive this too. In the weeks that followed, Amy learned the rhythms of the green estate, the way a shipwrecked sailor learns the tides, carefully and out of necessity. Max left the house before dawn most mornings and returned late, sometimes not at all. When he was home, he occupied the east wing like a ghost, present but untouchable. They shared meals occasionally, sitting at opposite ends of a dining table built for 20, eating in silence while the staff moved around them like stagehands between scenes. Amy refused to dissolve into the furniture. She started in the kitchen. Dolores had been running the household for 11 years, and Amy could see the exhaustion in her. So Amy began helping, not because she was told to, but because she needed to be useful, needed to feel her hands doing something that mattered. She learned the names of the gardeners. She brought coffee to the security team, during their night shifts. She asked Marco, Max's driver, about his daughter's school recital, and the next week she asked how it went. "Nobody asks us things like that," Marco told her one morning, his voice careful, as though kindness were a trap he'd learned to avoid in this world. "Maybe they should," Amy said. One evening she found Dolores crying in the pantry. Her grandson had been sick for weeks, and the medical bills were piling up. Amy sat with her on the floor between shelves of canned tomatoes and dried pasta, and she listened. The next morning, in she went to Max's study. He was behind his desk, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low, clipped tones that made the air feel dangerous. When he saw her, he ended the call without a word to whoever was on the other end. "Dolores's grandson needs surgery," Amy said. "The family can't afford it. And she's worked for you for 11 years. She runs your house. She knows your secrets, and she's crying in the pantry because she can't pay for her grandson's medical bills." Max stared at her for a long moment. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation, like a machine adjusting to unexpected input. "I'll handle it," he said. The surgery was scheduled within 48 hours. Top hospital. Best surgeon. Everything covered. Dolores wept when she found out. And she looked at Amy with an expression that said more than words ever could. Max never mentioned it again. But Amy noticed that later that week, he came to dinner on time. He even said good evening when he sat down. It was almost nothing. But in this house, almost nothing was everything. Amy found the photograph by accident. She had been looking for a book in the library, a real library, 2 stories high, with ladders on brass rails and first editions behind glass. She pulled a volume from a high shelf, and a photograph slipped out, drifting to the floor like a leaf. It was a woman. Dark hair, dark eyes, a smile so luminous it seemed to light the photograph from within. She was sitting on a park bench, laughing at something just outside the frame. And whoever had taken the picture had done so with the kind of attention that only comes from love. Amy turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting that was sharp and angular, Max's handwriting, she realized, were 2 words. Always Natalia. She put the photograph back, but the name stayed with her, lodged in her chest like a splinter. It was Marco who told her, eventually, not in one conversation but in fragments, offered cautiously over weeks. The way someone feeds a fire they're not sure they should be building. Natalia Sorvino. She had been Max's world. They met when he was 26, when he was still climbing, still hungry, still capable of softness. She was a teacher, elementary school, first graders, and she had no idea who he was when they first talked at a coffee shop in the village. She made him laugh. No one made Max Green laugh. They were together for 3 years. He was going to leave the organization for her. He had a plan, a timeline, an exit strategy. He was going to become someone worthy of her. Then, a rival family found out about her. Marco's voice went quiet when he reached this part of the story, and Amy understood that some details would never be spoken aloud. What she pieced together was this. Natalia was taken to send a message. Max got her back, but not in time. She died in a hospital 3 days later, and something in Max died with her. He blames himself, Marco said. He believes loving her is what killed her. And since then, he's made sure that no one gets close enough for it to happen again. Amy sat with this knowledge for days. She carried it carefully, the way you carry something fragile through a dark room. And she didn't bring it up with Max. She didn't try to discuss it, or analyze it, or offer comfort. She simply understood in a way that changed the shape of everything she saw. The coldness wasn't cruelty, it was armor. The distance wasn't indifference, it was fear. And the words he had whispered at the altar, "My heart belongs to someone else," were not a rejection of her. They were a confession of grief so deep. He had built his entire life around it. The shift didn't happen all at once. It happened the way dawn happens, so gradually that you can never identify the exact moment. The darkness becomes light. Max started noticing things, small things. The way Amy spoke to people, not with the performative kindness of someone trying to be liked, but with the genuine curiosity of someone who actually cared. And the way the house felt different since she arrived. Warmer somehow, as though she had changed the temperature of the air itself. He noticed that the staff smiled more. That Dolores hummed while she worked. That even his men, hardened, scarred men who had done things that would keep most people awake for the rest of their lives, softened slightly in Amy's presence. One evening, he came home earlier than usual and found her in the kitchen, teaching Marco's 12-year-old daughter to make empanadas. The girl was covered in flour, laughing so hard she could barely stand, and Amy was laughing with her, really laughing, the kind of unguarded joy that Max hadn't heard in his house in years. He stood in the doorway and watched. He didn't announce himself, he just stood there, and something inside his chest moved. A muscle that had been locked in place for so long, he'd forgotten it existed. "Mr. Green." The girl noticed him first and went rigid with fear. "It's fine," Max said. His voice was quieter than usual. "Continue." He walked away, but he didn't go to the East Wing. He went to the library, sat in the chair by the window, and stared at the river for a long time. The following week, he did something he hadn't done in years. He ate breakfast at the main table, not at his desk, not standing up in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, but at the table, at a normal hour, where Amy was already sitting with coffee and the newspaper. She looked up, surprised, and said nothing. She simply poured him a cup and slid it across the table. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the cold, punishing silence of the early weeks, but something more like peace. "The garden looks different," he said after a while. "I asked Eduardo to plant herbs near the kitchen. I hope that's okay." "It's fine." Another silence. Then, "Dolores told me what you did for her grandson." "You're the one who paid for it," Amy said. "You're the one who noticed." It was the closest thing to a compliment he had ever given her. Amy held it carefully, the way she held everything in this house, gently and without expectation. The attack came on a Tuesday. Amy was returning from the city. She had started volunteering at a literacy program downtown, something Max's people had grudgingly approved after weeks of security assessments, when the SUV was cut off on the highway. Two black sedans, no plates, military precision. Marco reacted instantly. He threw the car into reverse, tires screaming, and radioed for backup. Amy was pushed to the floor. She heard gunshots, sharp, percussive sounds that punched through the air like fists, and the rear window shattered above her, raining glass into her hair. The backup arrived in 4 minutes. The sedans disappeared. No one was seriously hurt, though Marco had a graze on his shoulder that he refused to acknowledge. When they arrived at the estate, Max was standing in the driveway. His face was stone, but his hands were shaking. Amy had never seen his hands shake. He didn't speak to her immediately. He spoke to his men, rapid, commanding, dangerous. Orders were given, phone calls were made. The machinery of his world lurched into motion with terrifying efficiency. It was hours later, well past midnight, when he came to her room. She was sitting in the armchair by the window, a blanket around her shoulders, still picking glass from her hair. "Are you hurt?" His voice was tight, controlled, but beneath it was something raw. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You have glass in your hair." "Then I'm mostly fine." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of her bed, closer to her than he had been since the altar. She could see the tension in his jaw, the way the muscle worked beneath the skin. He was furious, not at her, but at the situation, at the world, at the enemies who had dared to touch something that existed within his sphere of protection. "This is what I am," he said quietly. "This is the world I live in. People around me get hurt. People around me." He stopped. The sentence had a destination he couldn't reach. "I know what you're going to say," Amy said. "What, you're going to say that this is why you keep everyone at a distance, that caring about someone is a liability, that what happened today proves you were right to build walls." He looked at her, and for the first time, his guard was down. Not completely, not all at once, but enough that she could see the man behind the mask. He looked exhausted, and he looked haunted. He looked like someone who had been carrying a weight so heavy that his body had molded itself around it. "It does prove it," he said. "No," Amy said gently. "Well, it proves that your world is dangerous. It doesn't prove that you have to face it alone." He said nothing. He sat there for a long time, and then he stood and walked to the door. But before he left, he paused. "I'm glad you're safe," he said without turning around. The door closed. Amy pressed her hand to her chest and felt her heart hammering against her ribs, and she realized with a clarity that took her breath away that she was beginning to feel something for this broken, impossible man. 3 days after the attack, Max invited Amy to his study. It was the first time she had been inside the room. It was dark, paneled in mahogany, lined with books he had actually read. A desk the size of a small island dominated the center, and behind it, mounted on the wall, was a painting, a landscape of the Italian coast, golden light on blue water. "Sit down," he said, then catching himself. "Please." Amy sat. Max remained standing by the window, his back to her, his silhouette framed against the evening sky. "Her name was Natalia," he said. Amy didn't tell him she already knew. She simply listened. And he spoke for nearly an hour. He told her about the coffee shop, about the way Natalia argued with him about everything. Politics, movies, whether to put sugar in espresso. About the apartment they shared in Brooklyn, how she filled it with plants she couldn't keep alive, and books she read aloud to him at night. About the plans they made. About the morning he woke up and realized he loved her more than his own survival. And then he told her about the end. His voice didn't break. Max Green's voice was not built for breaking, but it became something else, thin, stripped, like a wire pulled so tight it began to hum. I held her hand in that hospital room for 3 days, he said, and I promised her I would never let it happen again. I promised her that I would never put someone in that position, never love someone enough that my enemies could use it against me. He turned from the window and looked at Amy. That's why I said what I said at the altar. It wasn't about you. It was about a promise I made to a dead woman in a hospital room 8 years ago. Amy felt tears on her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them. She let them fall. Max, she said softly, keeping that promise doesn't honor her. It just means her death controls you forever. He flinched. It was barely visible, a micro movement that most people would have missed entirely, but Amy saw it, and she understood that she had touched something that no one had been allowed to touch in years. She loved you, Amy continued. And if she loved you, she wouldn't want this. She wouldn't want you locked in a house full of people who are afraid of you. Married to a stranger you can't even look at, living like you're already dead. The room was so quiet she could hear the clock ticking on the mantel. You don't know what she would have wanted, Max said, but his voice had no edge. It was just sound, just words falling into the space between them like stones into water. Maybe not, Amy said, but I know what you deserve. And it's more than this. She stood and walked to the door. She paused, just as he had paused at her door 3 nights ago. Thank you for telling me, she said. Thank you for trusting me with her. She left, and behind her, in the dark study with the painting of the Italian coast, Max Green pressed his hands against his desk and bowed his head and felt something shift inside him, something tectonic, something that had been locked in place for 8 years, finally beginning to move. After that night, the architecture of their relationship changed. Max started joining her for meals, not just breakfast, but dinner too. The conversations were halting at first, like two people learning to walk after a long illness. He asked about her volunteering. She asked about his day, carefully skirting the edges of his work. He answered more than she expected. He began leaving his study door open. She began bringing him tea in the evenings, not because he asked, but because she noticed he forgot to eat or drink when he was working. He never thanked her, but the cup was always empty when she collected it. One night, during a storm that knocked out the power, they sat in the library by candlelight and talked for 4 hours. He told her about his mother, who died when he was 12. She told him about hers, who died when she was 19. They found in the geography of their grief a shared landscape. You're not what I expected, Max said, watching her in the flickering light. What did you expect? Someone who would fold. Someone I could ignore until this arrangement served its purpose and ended. Sorry to disappoint, Amy said, and something happened that neither of them expected. Max laughed, a real laugh, brief and rusty, like a machine running after years of disuse, but real. Amy stared at him, in the candlelight, with his guard down, and that unexpected sound still hanging in the air. He looked like a different man, younger, a less carved from stone, almost approachable. You should do that more often, she said. Do what? Laugh. It suits you. He looked away, but she caught the faintest trace of something on his face. Not quite a smile, but the memory of one, the blueprint of something that might, given enough time and courage, become the real thing. The power came back an hour later, but neither of them moved to turn on the lights. The crisis came without warning, as crises always do in Max's world. A federal investigation had been building for months. Wiretaps, informants, a grand jury assembling evidence behind closed doors. Max's lawyer delivered the news on a Friday afternoon. They were going to arrest several of his top men. The organization would survive, but the legal exposure was significant. What the lawyer didn't know What no one knew except Max and a very small circle was that the investigation had been accelerated by a leak from inside. Someone close, someone trusted. For 3 days, the estate was a war room. Max barely slept. Amy watched from the edges, bringing food that went uneaten, coffee that went cold. She could see him unraveling, not visibly, never visibly, but in the micro details. The way his sentences became shorter, the way his jaw tightened, until she could see the bones beneath his skin. On the third night, she found a document on the hallway floor, outside his study. It had been dropped by someone in a hurry, a printed email, heavily redacted, but with enough visible text for Amy to piece together the situation. The leak was pointing toward Dominic Kessler, Max's second-in-command, a man who had been with the organization for 15 years. Amy knew Dominic. He had been kind to her, one of the few who hadn't treated her like furniture. He had shown her photographs of his kids. He had told her that Max was a better man than he let anyone see. She also knew what happened to people in Max's world who were identified as Lex. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in her room and weighed what she was about to do. Understanding the risks, understanding that it could destroy everything. The fragile trust she had built with Max, the precarious safety of her position in this house, maybe even her life. In the morning, she went to Max's study. "Before you do anything about the leak," she said, "I need you to promise me something." His eyes were red-rimmed, dangerous. "I don't make promises. Make this one. Promise me you'll hear the full truth before you act. Promise me you'll look at this from every angle. Because I found something last night. And if I give it to you, and you react the way everyone expects you to react, someone might die who doesn't deserve to." Max studied her. The silence stretched until it became its own kind of sound. "You're protecting someone," he said. "I'm protecting you," she said. "From making a decision you can't take back." She told him about the document. She told him what she suspected, that the evidence against Dominic was planted, that someone else was behind the leak and was using it to eliminate a rival. She laid it out calmly, logically, with the quiet precision of someone who had spent her life solving problems that other people created. Max listened. When she finished, he picked up the phone and made 3 calls. Within hours, the truth emerged. The real leak was a lower-level operative named Salazar, who had been feeding information to the feds in exchange for a reduced sentence on unrelated charges. He had planted evidence against Dominic to cover his tracks. Dominic was cleared. The situation was handled. Late that night, Max found Amy in the garden. She was sitting on the bench near the herbs she had planted, wrapped in a coat, looking at the stars. "You risked everything today," he said. "It was the right thing to do. In my world, the right thing gets people killed. Then maybe your world needs better people in it." He sat beside her on the bench. It was the closest they had ever been, shoulder to shoulder, their breath visible in the cold air. For a long time, neither spoke. And then Max said very quietly, "I was wrong about you." "I know," Amy said, and for the second time he laughed. Softer this time, more real, and Amy felt the sound move through her like warmth, like sunlight finding its way through a crack in a wall that had stood for far too long. It happened on an ordinary evening. There was no crisis, no danger, no dramatic catalyst. Just a Tuesday in late autumn, the trees along the Hudson, burning gold and red, the air sharp with the promise of winter. Amy was in the library, reading. Max came in to find a book, or that was what he told himself. In truth, he had been finding reasons to be in whatever room she was in for weeks, circling her orbit like a planet drawn to a sun it had been trying to escape. She looked up when he entered. "The biography section is that way," she said, pointing toward the east wall. "How did you know I was looking for a biography?" "You always read biographies. You like knowing how other powerful men handled impossible situations." He stopped. "You pay attention." It's hard not to, she said. You're an interesting person when you let yourself be. He sat down across from her. The chair was close, closer than the dining table, closer than the garden bench, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, the faint scar on her left temple from a childhood fall she had told him about during one of their long evenings. Amy, he said. Her name in his mouth sounded different, heavier, more deliberate, as though he were testing its weight on his tongue for the first time. Yes? I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond. She closed her book. When I married you, he said, I treated you like a transaction, an item on a ledger. I told myself that was all you could ever be, all anyone could ever be, because the alternative was too terrifying. The alternative meant opening a door I had welded shut 8 years ago and facing what was behind it. He paused. His hands were clasped together, the knuckles white, and Amy could see the effort this was costing him. The physical toll of vulnerability on a man who had built his entire identity on invulnerability. But you, he shook his head slightly, as though arguing with himself. You didn't accept the terms I set. You didn't shrink. You didn't become invisible. You walked into my house and you changed it. You changed the people in it. You changed... Another pause, longer this time. You changed me. Amy's throat tightened. She said nothing, exactly as he had asked. I told you at the altar that my heart belonged to someone else, and for a long time that was true. Natalia had my heart, and I thought she would always have it, because keeping it with her meant I never had to risk losing it again. He looked at her then, really looked at her, with all his defenses stripped away, his gray eyes open and unguarded and terrified. But I was wrong. My heart isn't in that hospital room anymore. It's not buried with her. It's been moving, slowly, stubbornly, the way everything moves in my world, and it's come to rest somewhere I never expected. His voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. It's with you, Amy. My heart is with you, and I have no idea what to do with that, because the last time I loved someone, she died for it, and the thought of that happening to you is the only thing in this world that truly frightens me. The library was completely still. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. Amy stood. She crossed the space between them and knelt in front of his chair, placing her hands over his clenched fists. His hands were trembling. Max, she said, loving someone isn't what killed Natalia.